You smell like a Greyhound station and you're blocking my guests? If you leave right now, I won't have you arrested." Harriet Stowe leaned into the words, close enough that Jasper Flynn could see the powder crease at the corner of her mouth. Her white uniform blouse crisp under the overhead fluorescent glow of the terminal corridor. The lounge entrance stretched behind her in full afternoon light, pouring through the skylight panels above gate D7, and at least 30 travelers had stopped walking to watch. One of the security guards, a broad man in a short-sleeved black uniform shirt, already had 2 fingers hooked into Jasper's sleeve, and the crowd that had gathered was not telling him to let go. They were laughing. A woman in the front row actually applauded. Jasper's jaw tightened. He didn't move. He didn't argue. He just looked past Harriet's shoulder at the glass wall of the lounge, where a man in a charcoal suit had risen from the far table and was staring out at the scene with an expression Harriet had never learned to read, but should have. Welcome to Frost Folktales. This is where we tell the stories of those who were underestimated, dismissed, and targeted, yet chose courage over silence. If these stories move you, subscribe and be part of a community that refuses to let them fade into the background. Hargrove International Airport ran long and bright in the middle of the afternoon. The skylight panels that lined the ceiling of Concourse D were wide and generously spaced, and on a clear day they turned the terminal corridor into something that felt almost honest. All that overhead light with nowhere to hide. The Pinnacle Airways Platinum Lounge entrance sat at the corridor's midpoint, framed in brushed silver trim and frosted glass that went from floor to ceiling. A small illuminated sign above the door read Pinnacle Platinum, members and qualifying guests only, and the carpet at the threshold was a deep, unscuffed burgundy that stopped precisely at the public corridor tile, like a border drawn by someone who believed in borders. Jasper Flynn had walked up to that entrance at 2:14 in the afternoon, carrying a battered canvas carry-on slung over his left shoulder and a phone in his right hand at 9% battery. He was wearing a faded olive Henley, the kind that had been washed too many times in deployment laundry facilities to hold its shape. Frayed cargo pants in a shade of khaki that had started darker, and scuffed brown boots that had seen actual ground. He had been awake for 19 hours. His checked luggage was somewhere over the continental United States in a cargo hold that was not headed to Hargrove, and inside that luggage were his dress uniform, his summit materials, and the printed agenda that listed his name at the top of the keynote slot. He had a red-eye connection, missed by 11 minutes, to thank for all of it, and a rerouting through this airport that no one had asked him to approve. He had Roland Mercer's name in his phone, a meeting confirmed 3 weeks ago, the specific table inside the Platinum Lounge mentioned in the confirmation email. The words, "Mr. Mercer will meet you at the entrance personally if you arrive before 3. It was 2:14. He arrived before 3. He stated his name at the entrance desk calmly and clearly. He mentioned Roland Mercer. He mentioned the summit. He did not mention the Silver Star, or the 22 years, or the 3 combat deployments, or the Distinguished Flying Cross, because Jasper Flynn had long ago learned that a man who leads with his credentials is a man who is already apologizing for his presence, and he had decided somewhere over the Pacific during his second deployment that he would not spend the rest of his life apologizing for being in the room. Harriet Stowe had come from behind the entrance desk, with her chin lifted and her lanyard straightened, and her reading glasses pushed up to the top of her head like a crown she had not been formally awarded, but had decided to wear anyway. She was a compact woman in her late 50s, with silver-streaked hair pulled tight and a white uniform blouse with gold piping at the collar. Pinnacle Airways lounge staff, management grade, the kind of uniform that came with a title and the particular confidence of someone who controlled a door. She looked at Jasper Flynn the way people look at something that has ended up in the wrong place and become, as a result, a problem requiring correction. She asked if he had a platinum membership card. He said he was a guest of Roland Mercer. She asked if he had documentation of that. He said the confirmation was in his email, and he reached for his phone at 9% battery. And she said before he could unlock the screen that a verbal claim of guest status was not sufficient for lounge access under Pinnacle protocol, and that she would need to see a printed confirmation or a membership card. And she said it loudly enough that the couple nearest the entrance both looked up from their rolling luggage. What happened in the next 4 minutes was the kind of thing that moves fast once it starts. Harriet Stowe raised her voice. Terrence Bullock, broad, short-sleeved black uniform shirt, the kind of build that fills a doorframe and knows it, materialized from the corridor with the practiced arrival of a man who has been nearby the whole time. Isaiah Navarro appeared 2 steps behind him, younger, thinner, his eyes doing a quick assessment of the situation before settling at a point 6 inches below the horizon. And then 30 people who had been walking through Concourse D on their way to gates and connections and coffee found a reason to slow down and stop, because a scene is its own gravitational field, and crowds have always known how to gather around one. Harriet Stowe leaned in and said what she said. The Greyhound station, the blocking of guests, the mercy of not having him arrested. She said it with her chin at the precise angle of someone who has confused cruelty with authority for so long that she has stopped being able to feel the difference. Terrence Bullock had 2 fingers hooked into the fabric of Jasper's olive Henley at the upper sleeve before Harriet finished the sentence. He wasn't gripping, not yet, but the implication was architectural, a gate in the shape of a hand, a direction communicated without words. The woman in the front row clapped. One short, declarative clap, and then she looked around to see if anyone would join her. And a few people smiled, and someone near the back of the gathering said something low that produced a ripple of laughter, and the sound of it filled the corridor the way sounds fill corridors, all that overhead fluorescent and skylight, with nowhere for it to go but back. Jasper Flynn stood still. He didn't look at Bullock's fingers on his sleeve. He didn't raise his voice. He looked at Harriet Stowe, and whatever was in his eyes wasn't shame, wasn't anger, wasn't whatever face you put on when you know there's a camera. It was just quiet. 22 years in the cockpit and 3 deployments will do that to you, or at least they did it to him. You learn that reacting almost never helps. He breathed, left hand on the carry-on strap, jaw tight. He let the crowd be a crowd. They'd thin out in a minute and tell themselves a different version of this on the drive home. What he wasn't doing was looking away from the glass wall of the lounge behind Harriet's shoulder. Through it, at the corner table by the window, a man in a charcoal suit had been sitting with a black coffee and a printed itinerary, and now he was standing, not fast. He'd stood up the way you stand up when you've already done the math on something. The light through the glass was good, and his face was easy to read, if you knew how to read it. Harriet didn't, and wasn't looking anyway. Jasper was. He'd seen the face in the briefing packet, in the summit program, on the confirmation email that was still open on his phone at 9%. Roland Mercer, CEO, Pinnacle Airways, 53. Operations background. The trade press liked the word precise. His staff said calm, or terrifying, depending on who you asked and what kind of week they'd had. He'd asked for the corner table because he wanted to see the lounge entrance when Jasper walked in. He'd seen it. He was past surprise now, into the part where you've already started making calls in your head. Harriet missed all of it. Wrong angle, chin still up, Bullock's 2 fingers still hooked into Jasper's sleeve, and she gave that little nod she does, the one where she said her piece and now expects the room to take care of the rest. Bullock started walking backward. Practiced pressure, 2 fingers, the kind of grip a man uses when he's escorted people out of places before, and doesn't see why this one would go differently. Navarro moved with him, 2 steps off to the right, hands to himself, eyes on nothing. The crowd opened a lane through the fluorescent corridor. Jasper went with it. The alternative was to make the moment bigger than it deserved to be. And he was done doing that years ago. Faded Henley, frayed cargo pants, scuffed boots, one hand on the strap, the keynote loaded on the phone in his pocket. He walked backward at the pace Bullock set him. He passed the woman who'd clapped. She wasn't clapping anymore. She was on her phone. He passed the couple with the rolling luggage. He passed the guy near the back who'd said the thing under his breath that got the laugh. He didn't look at any of them. He looked at the corridor, and then once, over his shoulder, back at the glass. Mercer wasn't at the table. He was at the window. Coffee still sitting where he'd left it. Phone up to his ear. Watching Jasper get walked backward through a crowd with a face you couldn't really misread anymore. He was already on the call. Down at the back of the corridor, tucked between a charging kiosk and a newsstand, a woman named Fatima Osei had her phone up. 41 seconds of footage so far. 11 more before the scene drifted out of frame. And she got all 11. Her hands weren't perfectly steady. It didn't matter. The video was clear enough. The crowd started breaking up. Harriet turned back toward the lounge, smoothed the front of her white blouse, didn't look at the glass. Inside, Mercer was still on the phone. Outside, Jasper kept walking, carry-on over one shoulder, into the long, flat afternoon of Concourse D. Fatima watched her video back once. Then she hit share. The bench was gray plastic, cracked along the left armrest, bolted to the floor between a charging kiosk and a newsstand that sold $3 bottles of water and paperback thrillers with embossed gold lettering on the spines. Bench 14, Concourse D, Hargrove International Airport. Jasper Flynn sat down on it the way a man sits down when he has nowhere else to be and no intention of performing dignity for an audience. Slowly, deliberately, carry-on bag settled between his boots, spine straight, both hands resting open on his thighs. His phone read, 9% battery. He stared at that number for a moment. 9%. The kind of detail that would have been funny at a different hour, in a different life, on a different morning. He plugged the charging cable into the kiosk port, watched the screen flicker as the cable recognized the connection, and leaned back against the bench's hard plastic ridge. The overhead fluorescent panels ran the full length of Concourse D in a straight, unbroken line, flooding the corridor with the kind of flat white light that hid nothing and softened nothing. Afternoon sun pushed through the skylight panels set into the terminal roof at intervals, dropping hard rectangular blocks of natural light onto the polished floor. And the two lights combined, the clinical fluorescent and the blunt afternoon sun, made everything in Concourse D look exactly like what it was. No shadows, no mercy, just the thing itself. Jasper Flynn looked like a man who had been on 4 different aircraft in 31 hours. The faded olive Henley had been clean when he put it on at Langley. That was Thursday. It was now very much not Thursday. The frayed cargo pants, the color of sand, somewhere between tan and gray, were creased in the wrong places from hours in an economy middle seat on the rerouted connection. His scuffed brown boots had been on and on again through 4 security checkpoints. His jaw carried the particular density of stubble that accumulates not overnight but over days, when sleep comes in 90-minute intervals and there is no bag to open because the bag is not here. The bag was the thing. He let himself think about it for one careful moment. The way you press a bruise to assess the damage and then stop pressing. The red-eye out of Langley had left at 2 a.m. Dallas was supposed to be a 40-minute layover. A connection he had made 4 times before. A connection that had always felt tight but workable. What no one at the booking desk had accounted for was a runway hold at Langley. 38 minutes on the tarmac for a maintenance check that cleared cleanly but cleared late. And by the time he reached Dallas, the gate for his connection to Hargrove had closed with 11 minutes to spare. 11 minutes. He had walked that jetway corridor in Dallas, knowing the number before the agent at the desk said it. He had watched her face compute the same arithmetic he had already run. She had put him on the next available routing, which meant Hargrove via a carrier he had never flown. And the checked bag, the one with the dress uniform, the silver star in its presentation box, the summit briefing materials, the spare dress shirt, the notes he had spent 6 weeks building into a 40-minute keynote. That bag had continued on to its original destination without him. The airline had filed the trace. They had given him a reference number on a receipt he folded into his cargo pants pocket. They had estimated delivery to the summit venue by early evening, which would be, if it landed correctly, approximately 1 hour after he was scheduled to leave the podium. He sat on bench 14 and did not think about the dress uniform. He had made a decision in the Dallas terminal, a clean, executive decision, the kind you make at 30,000 feet when the weather is bad and the options are narrowing, which was that he would handle what was in front of him and let the rest work itself out. He had given a keynote on 2 hours of sleep, wearing borrowed clothes before. Not in this context, not at this summit, but the principle held. He would figure it out. He looked at his phone. The charge had crept to 11%. Enough. He had 11 missed calls. He sat with that number for a moment before he touched the screen. Not avoidance, assessment. 7 calls from Lorraine Baptiste. He could reconstruct those calls without listening to them. The first one checking his ETA. The second one noting his flight had been rerouted. The third one escalating. The fourth through seventh, forming a progression he knew from 8 years of working with Lorraine, which moved from professional concern to something closer to controlled alarm. 2 calls from Dr. Edmund Voss, who co-organized the summit and whose voicemail Jasper knew would be precise, polite, and loaded with the specific anxiety of a man who had introduced 40 keynote speakers in 15 years and never once had to announce a substitution. 1 call from a number he did not recognize, and 1 call from Roland Mercer's personal line. He had not listened to a single one. He had been in the air. He pressed play on Lorraine Baptiste's first voicemail, held the phone to his ear, and listened to her tell him that she was at the summit venue, that the AV team had confirmed his slide deck uploaded correctly, and that she had arranged a car to meet him at the terminal curb. Her voice was the voice of someone who had not yet begun to worry. He moved to the second, third, by the fourth. The worry was there, controlled but present, her cadence tightening in the way that meant she was standing still and not sitting down. He paused the playback. He was aware, in the abstract way of a man who has spent 22 years managing the emotional weather of other people while keeping his own barometric pressure steady, that somewhere in this terminal, a version of himself existed in someone's phone. He had seen Fatima Osei raise her phone. He had registered it the way he registered most things in the last 40 minutes, completely and without visible reaction, and he had filed it in the part of his mind where he kept the things he could not control. He did not know what she had done with the footage. He did not let himself spend energy guessing. What he thought about instead, sitting on bench 14 with the fluorescent light falling on his Henley and the afternoon sun making a rectangle of warmth across his boots, was something older than this airport and older than Harriet Stowe. He had been here before. Not this bench, not this concourse, but this particular intersection, this specific geometric point where a black man in the wrong clothes, in the wrong space, is made to explain his presence to someone who has already decided the answer. He had been standing in that intersection since he was 19 years old. He had been there in the ROTC office when a captain looked at his application and asked who had helped him with the essay. He had been there in the flight simulator room when the instructor said he must have natural instincts, the word natural carrying the weight instructors did not know they were placing on it. He had been there in the hallway outside a promotion board wearing a uniform with more hours and more deployments and more documented excellence than the man standing next to him, being looked at the way Harriet Stowe had looked at him, with a decision already made and a script already written. He had been there in different terminals, in different decades, sometimes in uniform and sometimes not, always arriving at the same requirement: prove it. Prove it again. Prove it differently. Prove it louder. Prove it without raising your voice. Prove it while someone has 2 fingers hooked into your sleeve. The exhaustion of it was not the exhaustion of shame. He felt no shame. He had understood by his late 20s that shame was the wrong response to someone else's failure of imagination, and he had set it down and left it somewhere behind him, somewhere on a flight line in Kandahar or a forward operating base in the Helmand River Valley, and he had never gone back for it. The exhaustion was something quieter and heavier than shame. It was the weight of repetition, the weight of knowing that you will perform this proof again tomorrow, and the day after, and on the day you collect your retirement papers, and possibly on the day someone eulogizes you in a room full of people who already know everything you ever accomplished. And still, there will be a moment, somewhere, when someone will look at you and see what Harriet Stowe saw and make you start from the beginning. He pressed play on Roland Mercer's voicemail. The message was 4 words: "I saw everything. Stay." Jasper Flynn held the phone against his ear for 2 full seconds after the message ended, as if waiting for more. There was no more. Just those 4 words, in a voice that was even and deliberate and carried the specific quality of a man who does not leave 4-word voicemails unless 4 words are precisely sufficient. He lowered the phone. In the terminal food court, 40 yards up the concourse, and past the turn where the corridor opened into a wide atrium of food stalls and plastic tables, Fatima Ose sat with a half-eaten order of fries going cold beside her phone. She had uploaded the video 11 minutes ago. Her hands were not entirely steady. She pressed refresh on the screen and watched the share count move, not tick upward the way a normal post moved, 1 and then 2 and then 3 over the course of a day, but jump. A jump of 40, a jump of 90. She watched the number cross 400 shares and kept watching, her fries untouched, her coffee going cold, her thumb hovering over the screen with the particular paralysis of someone who has released something into the world and is only now computing what that means. Her caption read, "They threw this man out of the VIP lounge like trash. Someone find out who he is." She had written it in 30 seconds, while the guards were still walking him backward through the corridor. She had not expected it to move this fast. She had posted similar videos before, things that felt important, things that deserved to be seen, and watched them collect 200 views over 3 days, and then go still. This was not doing that. This was moving like fire through dry grass, and she could see in the comments, which were multiplying faster than she could read them, that people were already asking the question her caption had asked. Who is he? Someone find out who he is. The hashtag someone had appended without her was already running in 4 separate threads. A veterans advocacy account she had never heard of had reshared it with the caption "Find this man" in capital letters. A travel blogger with 400,000 followers had added, "The woman in the white blazer needs to be identified immediately." Fatima Ose pressed refresh again. The number jumped. She set the phone down, picked up a fry, and then set the fry down too, because her hands were trembling slightly, and she didn't want to look at them. Back on bench 14, Jasper Flynn looked up from his phone at the ceiling of Concourse D. The fluorescent panels ran straight and white above him. The afternoon light came through the skylight in long, flat angles. The terminal moved around him, rolling luggage, gate announcements, the particular ambient noise of a large space full of people in transit, everyone going somewhere, everyone carrying something. He exhaled. It was slow and complete, the kind of breath you learn to take when your aircraft is in instrument conditions and the ground is somewhere below the clouds and you cannot see it, but you know with the certainty of training and experience and 22 years of bringing heavy things home safely, that it is there. Roland Mercer had said stay. Jasper Flynn looked at the charging kiosk. 17% battery. He looked at the newsstand to his left, where a rack of paperback thrillers sat under the fluorescent light with their gold-embossed titles catching the glow. He looked at the rectangular block of afternoon sun lying across the floor of the concourse, warm and exact and entirely indifferent to everything that had happened in the last 40 minutes. He did not move from bench 14. He stayed. The coffee had been going cold for 11 minutes. Roland Mercer knew this because he was the kind of man who noticed things, the kind of man who had built a $7 billion airline on the compounded interest of small, precise observations made before anyone else in the room knew they mattered. He noticed the coffee. He noticed the time. He noticed the way the afternoon skylight panels above Gate D7 threw clean, unforgiving light across the Pinnacle Platinum Lounge's polished floor, making everything inside look like it was being examined rather than simply illuminated. He was seated at the corner window table, the one he always requested when he flew through Hargrove, the one that gave him a diagonal sightline to both the lounge entrance and the corridor beyond the glass. On the table in front of him sat a printed summit itinerary, the kind his assistant produced on cardstock because Roland Mercer still believed that paper held information differently than a screen. His eyes had moved to the top of the page 17 times in the past half hour. The name at the top had not changed. Colonel Jasper Flynn, USAF retired. Keynote address, 3 p.m. Roland Mercer had memorized the briefing packet on the flight in. Not skimmed it, memorized it. The Silver Star citation, the 3 combat deployments, the Distinguished Flying Cross awarded after a retrieval mission over contested airspace that Roland, who had never worn a uniform, could barely imagine. He had memorized the photograph as well. A broad-shouldered man in dress blues, jaw squared, eyes holding the camera with the particular steadiness of someone who had looked at far more difficult things. He checked his watch. He checked his phone. He looked toward the lounge entrance. That was when he heard her voice. It came through the glass because a lounge guest near the entrance had pushed the door open on his way back from the bar, and the door had not yet swung closed. And in that narrow gap of unclosed air, Harriet Stowe's voice cut through with the clean precision of someone who had spent years making herself heard over ambient terminal noise. Roland Mercer could not hear every word. He heard the register, clipped, theatrical, pitched for an audience, and that was enough to make him rise from his chair before his mind had fully assembled an intention. He stood. He moved 2 steps toward the glass wall. The afternoon skylight overhead turned the corridor outside into a kind of stage, every surface bright, every face visible, every gesture exact and unambiguous. Roland Mercer placed one hand on the glass. He did not lean. He simply looked. He saw Terence Bullock first, the broad-shouldered security guard in the short-sleeved black uniform shirt, recognizable by the way he took up space, the way men who have been given small amounts of physical authority tend to fill every inch of the permission they've been granted. Terence Bullock had 2 fingers hooked into the sleeve of the man in front of him, not gripping, hooking, the way you might handle something you considered significantly beneath your concern. Roland Mercer's eyes moved to the crowd. 30 people, perhaps a few more, arranged in a loose semicircle that had the organic geometry of audiences everywhere, close enough to see, far enough to feel innocent. He watched a woman in the front row bring her hands together. He watched 2 men exchange a look and a smile. He watched the crowd do what crowds have always done when they decide the person being humiliated is not one of theirs. He watched Harriet Stowe's chin rise. It was a small movement, a millimeter perhaps 2, but Roland Mercer noticed it the way he noticed everything, and what he understood from it was not anger and not surprise. What he understood was satisfaction, a composed, proprietary satisfaction the expression of a person who believed they were performing a service and doing it well. Then the man in Terence Bullock's grip shifted his weight slightly, redistributing his balance with the automatic economy of someone for whom stillness under pressure was not a choice but a trained reflex. The shift changed his angle. The overhead fluorescence caught his face. Roland Mercer recognized him. He had seen the photograph 37,000 feet above the ground, in a window seat, with a cup of airline coffee and a briefing packet across his tray table. He had looked at that face long enough to understand something about its particular composure. He was looking at it now through a glass wall in a terminal corridor, and the face held the exact same quality. Not defeat, not humiliation, not the performance of dignity for a watching crowd. Just stillness, the specific, load-bearing stillness of a man who has decided that what is happening to him right now will not be the thing that moves him. Colonel Jasper Flynn, United States Air Force, retired. Roland Mercer stepped back from the glass. He picked up his phone. He did not move to the corridor. He did not raise his voice. He did not gesture for anyone's attention or make any movement that the remaining lounge guests could read as agitation. He stood beside his corner table with the cold coffee and the cardstock itinerary, and he made his first call. Vivienne Caldwell answered on the second ring. She was Pinnacle's head of communications, and she had the operational instincts of someone who understood that the space between an incident and a response was the most dangerous territory in corporate life. Roland Mercer told her what he had seen. He used 23 words. He told her to prepare a formal statement and to clear her next 2 hours. Vivienne Caldwell did not ask him to repeat himself. She said she understood, and the call ended. He called Dr. Edmund Voss next. The summit co-organizer picked up, with the tentative energy of a man who wasn't sure whether the call was good news or bad news, and had learned to brace for both. Roland Mercer told him that Colonel Flynn had encountered a delay of the lounge access variety, and that he would personally ensure the colonel arrived at the summit venue in time for his address. Dr. Edmund Voss began to say something, and Roland Mercer said he needed the line open, and thanked him, and the call ended. He called the Pinnacle Airways operations desk. The agent on duty answered with the standard greeting, and Roland Mercer gave his name and employee credentials and asked, with the perfect courtesy that powerful men use when they want to make clear that courtesy is a choice and not a limitation, to be connected to the captain of Pinnacle, Flight 1100, currently docked at Gate D9. He was told there might be a brief hold. He said that was fine. He stood beside his table and watched through the glass wall as Terence Bullock walked Jasper Flynn backward through the corridor, and the crowd parted to accommodate the passage, and Harriet Stowe watched from the entrance desk with that same composed, proprietary chin. The hold lasted 40 seconds. Captain Delia Okafor came on the line with the quiet, unhurried authority of someone who ran her cockpit at the same consistent register, regardless of weather, altitude, or whoever was on the other end of the radio. Roland Mercer told her he had an unusual request. He told her it would require her to make a PA announcement, not a flight announcement, but a full terminal announcement on Pinnacle's operational channel, and that the content of the announcement would be provided to her within the next 30 minutes. He told her that the announcement would involve publicly recognizing a passenger who had been mistreated in the terminal today. He asked if she was willing to do that. There was a pause that lasted exactly 1 second. Captain Delia Okafor said yes. She said it without hesitation and without qualification and without asking who the passenger was or what the announcement would say or whether this was the kind of thing that required a supervisor's clearance. She said yes, the way people say yes when the question is so obviously right that the only thing left is the logistics. Roland Mercer thanked her and said he would have the statement to her within 30 minutes. He ended the call. He stood for a moment with his phone in his hand. Outside the glass wall, the corridor was beginning to settle. The crowd was dispersing at the edges, people reclaiming their luggage and their interrupted journeys. though a cluster of 8 or 10 remained near the gate D7 entrance. Several of them were looking at their phones. Roland Mercer noticed this the way he noticed everything, and what he understood from it opened a quiet, precise space in his thinking that was not satisfaction and not relief, but something closer to inevitability. The morning was already past the point of containment. What mattered now was architecture, what got built in the next hour, and what got torn down. He made one more call. His assistant answered before the first ring finished. Roland Mercer asked him to pull Harriet Stowe's personnel file, her full employment record, her performance reviews, her incident history, her current contract, and to forward it to his phone and to Vivienne Caldwell's phone within the hour. His assistant said he would have it in 45 minutes. Roland Mercer said 45 was fine. He set his phone on the table. He looked at the summit itinerary. He looked at the name at the top of the page. He looked at the cold coffee he had not touched in the last 4 minutes and would not be touching now. He straightened his jacket, a single smooth motion, both hands moving simultaneously from the lapels to the bottom buttons, the way a person straightens a jacket when they are about to walk into something that requires them to be completely buttoned. He was wearing charcoal wool, the kind that held its shape across a long travel day, the kind that communicated without announcing itself. He picked up his phone. He left the coffee. He left the itinerary. He walked to the lounge entrance at the pace of a man who has somewhere to be and knows the exact distance between here and there. He passed the entrance desk without stopping. Harriet Stowe was still at her position. Roland Mercer registered this the way you register furniture in a room, its presence noted and assigned its proper proportion of relevance. And he did not look at her, and he did not break stride, and he pushed through the door into the corridor. The overhead fluorescents received him. The afternoon skylight panels ahead made the concourse bright and open and borderless in the way of spaces that have nothing to hide. Roland Mercer stood at the corridor's edge and looked down toward Concourse D. Jasper Flynn was already gone. The bench he would later find the colonel sitting on, gray plastic, between a charging kiosk and a newsstand. Number 14 painted in white on the seat back was visible from here if you knew to look for it. But at this distance it was just a bench, and the man on it was just a figure, and Concourse D was just a terminal corridor, moving people from one place to another with the ordinary indifference of infrastructure. Roland Mercer looked at the crowd that had not yet fully dispersed near gate D7. He looked at the people holding their phones. He looked at the way some of them were not walking anymore, were just standing, looking at their screens with the particular arrested attention of people watching something move faster than they expected. He understood what that meant. He had been in business long enough to know the difference between a fire and an accelerant, and he had been in enough rooms to know that certain videos, 47 seconds, overhead fluorescent clarity, a man's sleeve, and a crowd's laughter, were not fires waiting for air. They were already burning. The question was not whether the burn would reach Harriet Stowe. The question was whether Roland Mercer would be standing there with documentation, a statement, a captain's voice, and a prepared apology by the time it did. He would be. He looked down Concourse D one more time. Then he turned and walked back toward the lounge to wait for Vivienne Caldwell's call, leaving the corridor behind him, leaving the dispersing crowd, leaving the glass wall that had turned, in the last 11 minutes, from a barrier into a mirror. And what it reflected, if Harriet Stowe had known to look, was the precise and unhurried shape of consequences, gathering speed. The video is 47 seconds long. Fatima Osei uploaded it from the terminal food court at 2:14 in the afternoon, sitting at a plastic table beside a Sparrow, with a half-eaten slice of pepperoni going cold in front of her, and her hands trembling in a way she could not entirely explain. She had filmed it instinctively, the way anyone films a car accident, not because they planned to, but because something in the human nervous system recognizes a wrong thing happening in real time and reaches for documentation the way other generations reached for witnesses. She had captioned it without overthinking the words. She had pressed share before she could reconsider. And then she had set the phone face up on the table and watched the counter move. 40 views, 80, 212, 1,000, 306. She ate 3 bites of the pizza and forgot the rest of it entirely. The video itself is not dramatic in the way that most viral videos are dramatic. There is no shouting. There is no blood. The lighting is extraordinary. The harsh, unforgiving clarity of the overhead fluorescence in the Gate D7 corridor, mixed with the afternoon sun pouring down through the terminal's skylight panels, flooding every face and every gesture with the kind of bright, unflattering exposure that reveals exactly what it shows. There is nowhere to hide in that light. Fatima had not planned that either. The light had simply been there, doing what light does. In the first 7 seconds, you see the woman in the white uniform blouse and navy skirt. You can see her powdered creases, the gold and navy badge on her left lapel, her chin lifted at a precise angle that communicates something unmistakable, even with the volume off. The man in front of her is tall, broad in the shoulders, wearing a faded olive Henley and frayed cargo pants and scuffed brown boots, and he is standing completely still in a way that most people are not capable of. Most people, when confronted in a public corridor with a crowd forming a loose semicircle around them, will shift their weight or look at the ground or use their hands to signal something: apology, confusion, frustration. This man does none of those things. He stands with his carry-on over one shoulder and his hands at his sides, and if you watch his face, what you see is not anger and not humiliation, but a particular contained stillness that, once you understand what it is more affecting than either. At the 7-second mark, and people will note this in comment sections across 3 platforms within the first hour, there is a man in a charcoal suit visible through the lounge glass behind the woman in the white blouse. He is in the process of rising slowly from a corner table. His face is level. His hands are at his sides. He is watching. Most viewers, in the first wave of shares, do not notice the man in the charcoal suit. They notice other things first. They notice, at 11 seconds, the large security guard in the short-sleeved black uniform shirt stepping forward and pressing 2 fingers into the sleeve of the olive Henley. Not grabbing, 2 fingers. The casualness of it is somehow worse than a grab would have been. A grab implies urgency, even conflict. 2 fingers implies that the man in the olive Henley is something to be managed rather than engaged. A piece of furniture being repositioned, a door being nudged closed. They notice. At 19 seconds, a woman in the front row of the watching crowd lift both hands and bring them together once, sharply. 1 clap, a small sound, an endorsement. They notice. At 23 seconds, the woman in the white blouse lean forward slightly, and though there is no audio in the first version of the video that spreads, Fatima had been too far to capture clean sound. You can see the words form on her lips with enough clarity that several commenters will type them out before the first hour is over. Greyhound Station. The words are legible. The satisfaction on the face that forms them is also legible. They notice, at 31 seconds, the man in the olive Henley being walked backward by the 2 security guards, the large one with 2 fingers in his sleeve and the younger one 2 steps behind, and the crowd parting to let them through, and the man's eyes moving across the faces of the people watching him, and his face not changing. At 47 seconds, the video ends. Fatima had pocketed the phone because the guards had looked in her direction and she had not wanted to be asked to stop. By 2:47 in the afternoon, 33 minutes after she posted it, the view count crossed 4,000. A travel blogger with 112,000 followers reposted it with the words, "This happened at Hargrove International today and I cannot stop watching this man's face." Someone find out who he is. A veterans advocacy account with 250,000 followers shared it 17 minutes after that with the caption, "Find this man. He deserves better than this." The share thread began compounding. A local news affiliate social media editor, monitoring trending content as part of her standard afternoon workflow, flagged it to her producer at 3:02. The producer watched it twice and picked up her phone. Inside the Pinnacle Airways Platinum Lounge, the afternoon light came through floor-to-ceiling glass panels in long, clean rectangles, and the ambient noise was the polite sound of people who had paid for the right to be comfortable. Soft luggage wheels on carpet, the hiss of an espresso machine, the quiet tones of departure gate screens updating. The lounge smelled like fresh ground coffee and new leather and climate-controlled air that had never touched anything difficult. Harriet Stowe moved through it with the ease of a person in her natural environment. She had returned to the entrance desk within 4 minutes of the ejection, smoothed the front of her white uniform blouse with both palms, and resumed her position. She had adjusted the collar. She had checked the alignment of her badge. A regular guest, a silver-haired man in a navy blazer, who flew the Hargrove to Boston route every Tuesday, had caught her eye from his usual armchair and given her a small, approving nod. "You handled that beautifully," he said when she passed within speaking distance. "Some people simply don't understand that environments like this exist for a reason." Harriet Stowe had said, "Thank you, Mr. Calloway," and felt the satisfaction of a thing done correctly. She had returned to the entrance desk and begun reviewing the guest access log for the 4:15 inbound from Atlanta, because the work did not stop, and she was a professional, and the corridor was already quiet again. And that was as it should be. She did not know that 47 seconds of the afternoon had left the building. Gerald Stowe was in the Concourse B supervisor's office, reviewing a staffing overlap issue for the Tuesday morning shift, when his phone rang from a number identified as Airport Communications. He answered it on the second ring because Airport Communications calling a shift supervisor on a Tuesday afternoon at 3 o'clock was not routine, and Gerald Stowe had been at Hargrove International long enough to know that non-routine calls from that particular extension tended to require an immediate response. The call lasted 90 seconds. When it ended, Gerald Stowe closed his staffing spreadsheet, stood up, took his jacket from the back of his chair, and walked toward Concourse D at a pace that was not quite a run, but was the pace of a man who understood that the distance between where he was and where he needed to be was not acceptable. He did not know exactly what he was walking toward. He knew enough to walk faster. 2 concourses away, in Gate E22's standard departure seating area under the steady overhead fluorescent panels, Councilman Hugh Delaney was waiting for a 4:40 connection and reading a transportation infrastructure report on his tablet when the man beside him, a younger man in a conference lanyard, turned his phone toward him and said, "Have you seen this? It's from here, right here in this terminal." Councilman Hugh Delaney was on the Airport Authority Board. He had been on it for 6 years. He watched the 47 seconds without speaking. Then he watched them again. Then he set the transportation infrastructure report face down on the seat beside him, pulled out his own phone, and called the Airport Authority Director's direct line. The director answered on the first ring, which told Delaney that someone else had already called. He said, "Tell me you've seen it." The director said, "I'm watching it right now." Delaney said, "I'm in the building." There was a pause. The director said, "I know." At the National Aviation Leadership Summit venue, a conference center 14 minutes from Hargrove International by car, currently busy with registration tables, banner installations, and the controlled chaos of an event 90 minutes from its opening, Lorraine Baptiste was standing beside a podium riser, reviewing the teleprompter settings for Colonel Jasper Flynn's keynote, when her phone buzzed with the first share notification. She had the kind of professional instincts that caused her to open it immediately, because notifications in her line of work were frequently either irrelevant or urgent, and the distance between the two categories was never knowable in advance. She watched 47 seconds of her client being walked backward through a terminal corridor by a security guard with 2 fingers in his sleeve, and something inside her chest went very quiet and very cold. She called Jasper Flynn's number. It went to voicemail. She called again. Voicemail. She called a 3rd time, and this time she left a message, keeping her voice professionally level with the precise effort of a woman who had worked in crisis communications for 15 years and understood that panic was a luxury that nobody in her position could afford. Then she called Dr. Edmund Voss, the summit co-organizer, who answered in the middle of saying her name because he was already calling her on the other line. She switched over. He said, "Tell me he's all right." She said, "I can't reach him." He said, "Roland Mercer left the lounge 20 minutes ago." Someone in the terminal said he walked down toward Concourse D. Lorraine Baptiste processed that information in approximately 2 seconds. She said, "Then he's not alone." She hung up and switched to crisis communications mode in the professional sense of the phrase, meaning she opened a new document on her phone, began drafting a preparatory statement, and started making calls to the summit's media liaison, the Air Force Public Affairs Office, and her own assistant simultaneously, because the video was moving and the story was not going to wait for anyone to be ready for it. In the food court, Fatima Nosé had abandoned the pizza entirely. She was sitting with both hands around a coffee cup, watching the share counter with an expression of someone watching a fire they lit with a single match and understanding, for the first time, how fire actually moves. Her original caption, "They threw this man out of the VIP lounge like trash. Someone find out who he is," had been screenshotted and reposted so many times that it was now appearing in feeds she would never see, on phones in cities she had never visited, in the feeds of people who were in the process of forwarding it to people they knew who knew people who might know something. She did not yet know his name. She did not yet know what the man in the charcoal suit visible at the 7-second mark had been doing for the last 43 minutes. She did not know about the call to the operations desk, or the question that had been asked of a specific pilot, or the single word that had been given in response. She would find out all of it shortly. Everyone in the terminal would. At 3:19 in the afternoon, the terminal PA system clicked on. The sound was the standard sound, the brief tone, the slight ambient shift as speakers throughout the concourses came to full activation, the half-second of silence before a voice begins. Travelers throughout Hargrove International registered it automatically, the way bodies register sounds they have been conditioned to associate with information. Gate changes, boarding calls, the logistical rhythms of a building designed to move people from one place to another. Then the voice came through, and it was not the voice of a gate agent reading departure times. It was the voice of a woman who had spent 22 years in cockpits, who had given instructions over intercoms and radios and crew communication systems in conditions that required absolute clarity of tone and absolute absence of anything that might be mistaken for uncertainty. It was a voice that had on more than one occasion spoken into complete silence and been the only sound in a room full of people who needed to hear exactly what she said and believe every word of it on first hearing. Captain Delia Okafor's voice filled every concourse of Hargrove International Airport, steady and unhurried, carrying the full weight of a woman who had spent 2 decades commanding rooms full of people who underestimated her. And it carried something else, the particular authority of someone who had been asked a specific question, given a specific answer, and was now delivering on that answer with the precision she gave to everything she did at altitude. The food court went quiet. A gate agent's hand paused mid-scan. In the Pinnacle Airways Platinum Lounge, a woman in a white uniform blouse stopped mid-sentence. The voice began. The click came first, that single, mechanical click of a PA system activating, the kind of sound so embedded in the architecture of airports that most people stop hearing it After the first hour of travel, a reflex sound, background noise, the auditory equivalent of white paint on a wall. But something about this click was different. Maybe it was the timing. Maybe it was the frequency, slightly lower, slightly more deliberate than the automated gate announcement systems that had been cycling through arrival updates all afternoon. Maybe it was simply that the human ear, trained by millions of years of survival instinct, knows the difference between a machine speaking and a person choosing to speak. Whatever the reason, in the food court of Concourse C at Hargrove International Airport, a woman named Denise Tran was 3 words into ordering a grilled chicken wrap when her mouth simply stopped moving. The teenager behind the counter stopped reaching for the bread. The man behind Denise Tran, already impatient, already checking his watch, let his arm fall back to his side. The overhead fluorescent panels bathed the food court in their unsparing afternoon light, and 43 people in that food court became completely, inexplicably still. At Gate D9, a gate agent named Marcus Prieto had just raised his scanner to process a boarding pass when the click came through the speaker mounted directly above his station. His arm stayed raised, the scanner stayed unscanned. The passenger in front of him, a woman in a red blazer and gray slacks who had been mid-reach for her phone, looked up at the ceiling the way people do when they are trying to hear something they are not yet sure they are hearing. In the Pinnacle Airways Platinum Lounge, Harriet Stowe was accepting a compliment. The man offering it was a regular, a quarterly business traveler named Aldous Pemberton, who wore linen well and always ordered the same sparkling water with a wedge of lime. He had watched Harriet Stowe manage the earlier situation with approval. That was the word he used, situation. And he was telling her that the lounge was better run than any he'd visited in 6 cities this quarter, and that the staff reflected the standard of the airline itself. Harriet Stowe's chin was at that precise angle that communicated professional modesty while communicating nothing of the sort. Her white uniform blouse was still impeccable, the pressed creases at her forearms exactly as she had pressed them before her shift. She opened her mouth to respond to Aldous Pemberton's compliment. The click came through the lounge speaker. The voice that followed it was unhurried, precise. The voice of a woman who had spent 20 years communicating critical information to people whose lives depended on the accuracy and calm of what she said. Captain Delia Okafor did not rush. She did not perform. She simply spoke. Ladies and gentlemen, this is an important announcement from Pinnacle Airways. Harriet Stowe's open mouth stayed open. On bench 14 in Concourse D, between a charging kiosk and a newsstand, under the steady wash of natural skylight pouring through the terminal's overhead glass panels, Colonel Jasper Flynn was sitting with his eyes closed, his battered canvas carry-on rested between his scuffed boots. His phone was at 14%, charged just enough by the kiosk to hold 4 words of a voicemail in its memory. His olive Henley was faded in the shoulders. His cargo pants were frayed at the right cuff. His hands were resting on his knees, open, palms up, not a posture of defeat, but of a man who has learned, over 22 years and 3 combat deployments, that the body needs to be given permission to rest when rest is available. He had been sitting for 38 minutes. He heard the click. He did not open his eyes. We would like to take a moment to recognize a distinguished guest traveling through our terminal today. In the food court, the teenager behind the counter put down the bread entirely. Denise Tran's hand found the counter edge without her looking for it. Colonel Jasper Flynn, United States Air Force, retired. The name moved through the terminal the way names move when they carry weight, not loudly, but with a density that makes people turn toward the sound rather than away from it. A man in a departure gate on Concourse B looked up from his laptop. A family at a terminal window seat. 3 children arranged between 2 parents eating sandwiches. All 4 adults stopped chewing at approximately the same moment. Recipient of the Silver Star, the Distinguished Flying Cross, 3 Air Medals, and keynote speaker for today's National Aviation Leadership Summit. At Gate D9, The woman in the red blazer lowered her phone to her side. Marcus Prieto lowered his scanner. Neither of them spoke. Neither of them needed to. In the Platinum Lounge, Aldous Pemberton's expression had changed. It had changed in the specific way that faces change when information arrives that reorders what came before it. Not quickly, but steadily, like a photograph developing. He was not yet looking away from Harriet Stowe, but he was no longer looking at her the same way. Was denied access to our Pinnacle Platinum Lounge by a member of our staff, and was physically removed from the premises. Harriet Stowe's hand found the edge of the entrance desk. Near the lounge entrance, Terrence Bullock was standing with his arms at his sides, his short-sleeved black uniform shirt tied across his shoulders, and he was looking at Isaiah Navarro. Not saying anything, just looking. Isaiah Navarro was not looking back at him. Isaiah Navarro was looking at the polished floor between his shoes, and he had been looking at that floor for the better part of an hour, and the expression on his face was the expression of a man who had told himself he had no choice and was now being asked to examine that claim in public. On bench 14, Jasper Flynn's breathing had not changed. His hands on his knees had not moved. His eyes remained closed, and he listened to his name move through the terminal. His name, his rank, his decorations, spoken aloud in a space that 40 minutes ago had filled with laughter at his expense. And he received the words the way he received turbulence at altitude, without resistance, without panic, with the full knowledge that the aircraft knows what it is even when the weather doesn't. Pinnacle Airways extends its deepest and most sincere apology to Colonel Flynn. A child's voice broke the silence in the family section near the terminal windows. She was small, maybe 6 years old, wearing a yellow shirt and dark leggings, and she turned her face up toward her mother with the absolute, uncomplicated directness that only children have access to. "Mama, what's a silver star?" Her mother looked down at her. Then she looked at the speaker mounted above the window. Then she looked back at her daughter, and her voice, when she answered, was softer than it might otherwise have been. "It means he did something very brave," she said, when it was very hard to be brave. The little girl considered this with the seriousness it deserved. How hard? Her mother pulled her in by the shoulder, gently. "The hardest kind," she said. In the Platinum Lounge, Aldous Pemberton had turned away from Harriet Stowe. Not dramatically, not with a statement. He simply turned, the way people turn when the conversation they are part of has ended without a formal conclusion, and he walked back toward the interior of the lounge. Harriet Stowe watched his linen jacket move away from her. She did not call after him. She was not certain in this moment that her voice would produce the right sounds. "A member of our executive team is en route to his location now." Harriet Stowe's eyes moved to the lounge entrance, involuntarily, like a reflex, and Roland Mercer was not there. She could see through the glass wall to the interior of the lounge, and Roland Mercer's corner table was empty, his black coffee sitting cold beside a printed summit itinerary, and the chair where he had been sitting was pushed back at an angle that told her he had left quickly and had not pushed it back in. He was already gone. "Colonel Flynn, if you can hear this, please remain where you are." The pause that followed was not an accident. Captain Delia Okafor was too practiced for accidents. The pause was the same pause she used in the cockpit when she needed the next words to land with their full weight, undiluted by what came before them. "You are our guest." The PA system clicked off. The terminal did not immediately return to itself. There is a specific quality to collective human silence. It has texture, it has direction, and at Hargrove International Airport, in the afternoon light of a Thursday, the silence that followed Captain Delia Okafor's voice had the texture of reckoning. People in departure gates looked at the people beside them. People in the food court looked at their phones, some for the first time, landing on a 47-second video that was approaching 40,000 views, and then looked up again with new expressions. Gate agent Marcus Prieto finally lowered his arm and set the scanner on the counter with deliberate care, like a man setting something fragile down. In the Platinum Lounge, one of the guests who had laughed, a woman in a pewter blazer and dark slacks who had aped Harriet Stowe's satisfaction 40 minutes ago, was now looking at her phone with both hands, the screen filling her face with pale light in a room already full of fluorescent overhead brightness. She did not look up. She was watching 47 seconds of herself, and the 47 seconds were watching her back. Terrence Bullock said nothing to Isaiah Navarro. Isaiah Navarro continued to look at the floor. The floor did not offer anything useful in return. Harriet Stowe stood at the entrance desk of the Pinnacle Platinum Lounge. Her lounge, the space she had managed with precision and pride and the unexamined certainty that she knew exactly who belonged in it and who did not. And she was absolutely still. The crease in her white uniform blouse was still impeccable. Her posture had not collapsed. The stillness was not the stillness of a woman gathering herself. It was the stillness of a woman in the instant after a structure fails, when the body has not yet received the full report of what has just been lost. The afternoon skylight panels overhead flooded the corridor with light that did not care about any of this. Natural light never does. On bench 14 in Concourse D, Jasper Flynn opened his eyes. The terminal ceiling above him was the same as it had always been. Industrial panels, recessed fluorescent fixtures, the occasional overhead speaker mounted at even intervals down the concourse. The same ceiling that had been there when he sat down. The same ceiling that had been there when the crowd laughed. The same ceiling that had been there for every traveler who had passed through this corridor without incident, without humiliation, without a 47-second record of what happened to them. He looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at the charging kiosk beside him, unplugged his phone, and coiled the cable back into his carry-on with the practiced efficiency of a man who is packed and unpacked under conditions that make an airport bench look like a hotel suite. He stood. The carry-on strap went over his left shoulder. His boots were still scuffed. His cargo pants were still frayed at the right cuff. His olive Henley was still faded in the shoulders. He reached up with one hand and smoothed the Henley flat across his chest, pulling the fabric taut at the collar, adjusting the drape at his shoulders. His fingers moved without hurry, locating invisible wrinkles and addressing them with the calm, exact attention of a man who has spent a career understanding that how you present yourself in the moment after difficulty is the truest measure of who you are. He was not performing composure for the travelers who were watching him from the gate seats across the concourse, and some of them were watching now because the PA system had given them a name to attach to the man on the bench, and the name had weight. He was not performing anything. He was simply a man who knew how to wear whatever he was wearing. He straightened the Henley with the same deliberate precision with which other men straighten dress uniforms. He checked that his phone was in his pocket. He squared the carry-on strap on his shoulder. He looked down the length of Concourse D toward the Platinum Lounge entrance and whatever was moving toward him from that direction. And he waited, not because he had nowhere to go, not because the morning had taken something from him that he needed returned. He waited because Roland Mercer had left 4 words on a voicemail, and those 4 words had been a promise, and Jasper Flynn had spent 22 years understanding the difference between people who made promises and people who kept them. The afternoon light through the terminal's skylight panels was direct and clear and made no accommodations for anyone's comfort. It illuminated everything equally. The scuffs on his boots, the fraying at his cuff, the clean set of his jaw, and the absolute, unwavering steadiness in his eyes. All of it visible, all of it lit, all of it exactly what it had always been. The Pinnacle Platinum Lounge door opened at 2:47 in the afternoon, and Roland Mercer walked through it the way a man walks through a door he owns, which, Technically, he did. He did not pause at the entrance desk. He did not slow his stride to look at the woman standing behind it. He did not acknowledge the tablet she reflexively reached for, the practiced professional smile she assembled in the quarter second she had before he was level with her, or the breath she drew to form the words that would explain everything, justify everything, reframe everything into a shape that made sense and kept her world intact. He walked past her, close enough that Harriet Stowe could smell the cedar and coffee scent of his jacket, close enough that she took a half step back from the desk by instinct, creating space that he didn't need because he wasn't stopping. He was already past her, already in the corridor, already moving down Concourse D with his hands loose at his sides and his charcoal jacket buttoned and his eyes fixed on the middle distance at a point somewhere near the intersection of Gate D9 and whatever came next. Harriet Stowe turned. She watched the CEO of Pinnacle Airways, the man whose photograph hung in the staff break room, whose signature appeared on every company policy binder, whose approval determined the operational fate of every lounge, every gate, every uniform she had ever worn, walk away from her down the corridor without breaking stride, without looking back, without giving her a single syllable to work with. His footsteps didn't echo. The overhead fluorescent panels and the wide afternoon skylight flooding through the terminal ceiling above Concourse D swallowed every sound into an ordinary Tuesday afternoon at Hargrove International. And that ordinariness was somehow the worst part. No alarm, no scene, no confrontation, just a man in a charcoal suit choosing, in the clearest possible terms, not to spend another second in her presence. Harriet Stowe's hand rested on the edge of the entrance desk. She said his name, Mr. Mercer, 2 syllables, both of them landing on nothing. Roland Mercer did not look back. Bench 14 sat between a charging kiosk and a newsstand that sold paperback thrillers, individually wrapped headphones, and miniature bottles of hand lotion arranged in a rack someone restocked with mechanical regularity. The bench was gray plastic. The seat was shaped by 1,000 people who had sat in it waiting for connections and delays and news from home. The overhead fluorescent light above it was bright and indifferent and showed everything clearly. Jasper Flynn was standing. He had the canvas carry-on in his right hand, hanging at his side, and he was standing the way he always stood, weight-centered, shoulders level, nothing in his posture suggesting that the last 40 minutes had cost him anything he wasn't prepared to spend. His faded olive Henley sat straight across his shoulders. His frayed cargo pants carried the geometry of a man who wore clothes as functional equipment rather than decoration. His scuffed brown boots were planted on the terminal floor with the quiet certainty of a man who understood terrain. He saw Roland Mercer coming from 60 feet away. He didn't move toward him. He didn't adjust his expression. He stood on the same square of floor he had occupied since Captain Delia Okafor's voice finished carrying his name and his medals and his service record through every speaker in Hargrove International, and he waited with the particular patience of someone who has learned, at altitude and under fire, that waiting is not the same as yielding. Roland Mercer crossed the 60 feet without hurrying and without theater, and when he reached bench 14 he stopped, and the 2 men looked at each other in the afternoon light that poured through the skylight panels above them, clean and direct, and hiding absolutely nothing. Roland Mercer extended his hand. Colonel Flynn. His voice was measured and unhurried, the kind of voice that had delivered hard news in boardrooms and harder news in press conferences, and he gave none of that practiced weight to it now. He said it the way a man says something he means. I'm Roland Mercer. I'm sorry you spent a single minute on that bench. Jasper Flynn looked at the extended hand for exactly 1 beat. Not reluctance, not theater, but the natural pause of a man whose read of a room is reflexive and precise. And then he took it. His grip was firm and brief and equal. I've slept in worse places than this, Mr. Mercer. A breath, and then the rest of it, offered without self-pity, and without performance, offered the way a fact is offered. I spent 3 months in a forward operating base outside Kandahar. Cots and plywood and dust that got into everything. This bench had a charging kiosk. Something moved through Roland Mercer's expression. Not pity, not relief. Something closer to the recognition a man feels when another man shows him exactly who he is. Without decoration, then you've earned far better, Roland Mercer said, than what happened here today. The crowd was still there, not the entire crowd. 40 minutes had redistributed most of the original witnesses to gates and food courts and rideshare pickup points, but a significant portion of Concourse D had been reorganized, quietly and without announcement, around the gravitational pull of Captain Delia Okafor's PA announcement. The travelers who had been near Gate D7 when Terence Bullock walked a man backward through a corridor, while a woman in a white blouse watched with her chin lifted. A number of those people had not left. A number of them had watched the 47-second video on their phones, and then looked up at the lounge entrance, and then back at their phones. And when the PA announcement came through the overhead speakers, those people did not move at all. They were watching Bench 14 now. They watched a CEO in a charcoal suit shake hands with a black man in frayed cargo pants on a public airport concourse, and the image did something to the air of the terminal that was difficult to name but impossible to miss. It was the image of a world briefly correcting itself. It was the image of a thing that should have happened 40 minutes ago, happening now, in the unforgiving overhead fluorescent light and the clean afternoon natural skylight above Concourse D, in front of every person who had been there and every person who was learning what had happened in real time on their phone screen. Fatima Osei had her phone up. She was standing 9 feet from Bench 14, and she was filming with the steadiness of someone who understood now that she was documenting something that would matter later. Her hands did not tremble this time. Earlier, in the food court, her hands had trembled because she hadn't expected 40 views to become 4,000 inside an hour. She had recalibrated since then. She held the frame steady, and she caught the handshake, and she caught the exchange of words she could not hear, and she caught the expression on the faces of the people watching from the concourse, which was an expression she didn't have a precise word for but that she would describe later in the caption, simply as, "The terminal finally got quiet." She kept filming. Roland Mercer fell into step beside Jasper Flynn, not ahead of him and not behind him, beside him. The distinction was architectural. It said something about who was escorting whom, which was nobody. 2 men walking in the same direction at the same pace, toward the same door. The crowd in Concourse D parted the way crowds part, for something they recognize as significant, not because anyone told them to move, but because human beings understand procession when they see it. The path to the Pinnacle Platinum Lounge opened in front of Roland Mercer and Jasper Flynn like something obvious. The overhead fluorescent panels lit it. The skylight above it poured afternoon clarity across every face, watching from the periphery. Jasper Flynn did not look at the crowd. He had been in rooms full of people who underestimated him. He had stood at the podium of a forward operating base command briefing with 12 hours of no sleep behind him, and delivered an operational assessment with the precision of a man who understood that clarity is a form of protection. He had sat in debriefs where the questions were hostile and the faces were closed, and he had answered each one with a specific, unembellished truth and let it do the work. He understood, with 22 years of training in his body, that the moment you start performing for the audience is the moment you lose the room. He walked. The entrance to the Pinnacle Platinum Lounge was 10 feet ahead. Harriet Stowe was still standing there. She had not moved from the entrance desk since Roland Mercer walked past her without acknowledgement. She stood with her hands at the edge of the desk, her crisp white uniform blouse precisely pressed under the overhead light, her name badge catching the fluorescent glow, her expression cycling through a range of possibilities, explanation, justification, appeal, that had not yet settled on any one because none of them had found a surface to land on. Roland Mercer and Jasper Flynn stopped in front of her. The crowd outside Concourse D was watching. Fatima Osei's camera was steady. Roland Mercer looked at Harriet Stowe for a long moment. Not with anger. Anger would have given her something to push against, something to absorb and reframe. What he gave her was simpler and considerably more final. The look of a man conducting a rapid assessment and finding the outcome exactly what he expected. Then he spoke, quietly enough that it was for her and Jasper Flynn alone. The words sealed inside the 3 feet of concourse between the entrance desk and the lounge door. Not for the crowd, not for the cameras, not for the record that would be built later in a room with fluorescent lights and an HR representative and a formal notice on a table. You should call your union representative this afternoon. 9 words. Harriet Stowe's hands pressed flat against the edge of the entrance desk. Her mouth opened. Nothing came through it. Roland Mercer stepped aside and extended one hand toward the lounge entrance. Not a grand gesture, not a performance. Simply the natural movement of a man indicating that a door is open and a guest is welcome to walk through it. Jasper Flynn looked at the entrance. It was the same door. It was the same door that Terrence Bullock had walked him backward through 43 minutes ago. 2 fingers hooked into his sleeve while the crowd laughed, and a woman in a white blouse watched with her chin lifted and said something about a Greyhound station. It was the same door that had been a wall when he was standing on the outside of it, with his carry-on on his shoulder and 22 years of service on his back, and a keynote speech loaded on a phone at 9% battery. The door was open now. Jasper Flynn walked through it. The crowd outside Concourse D watched him go, not in silence. Somewhere in the periphery, a child was asking her mother a question, and a gate agent 2 concourses over had stopped mid-scan to look at her phone, and the terminal was doing what terminals do, which is continue. But there was a quality to the watching that the terminal had not had 43 minutes ago. It had the quality of a room that has just seen something it will not forget. Fatima Osei lowered her phone and looked at the screen for a moment. Then she typed a new caption over the one she had posted an hour ago in the food court. The original had read, "They threw this man out of the VIP lounge like trash. Someone find out who he is." The new one was 3 words. She hit post. The lounge door closed behind Jasper Flynn. Harriet Stowe stood at the entrance desk in the bright afternoon light that hid absolutely nothing. The lounge was still buzzing. That was the first thing Gerald Stowe noticed when he pushed through the glass door of the Pinnacle Platinum Lounge at Hargrove International. Not the unusual density of guests clustered in conversation, not the way 2 of the lounge attendants near the service bar had gone very quiet and very still, but the particular frequency of the buzzing itself. He had worked airport operations for 19 years. He knew the difference between the ambient noise of travelers killing time and the charged, low-voltage hum of a room that had witnessed something and was now processing it in real time, trading details, pulling up phones, confirming what they thought they saw with what the screen was showing them. He found Harriet Stowe at the entrance desk. She was standing precisely where she always stood. Weight distributed evenly, posture correct. White uniform blouse pressed into clean vertical lines. The laminate badge clipped at her left lapel, catching the overhead fluorescent light with every small shift of her shoulders. She had her hands folded on the desk surface. She was watching the concourse. From a distance, she looked composed. Gerald had known Harriet Stowe for 3 years. From closer, he could see that the composure was structural, not felt. The way a wall holds after the foundation has already begun to move. He didn't say anything in the lounge. He came to the desk, said her name once, and tilted his head toward the staff corridor door beside the service counter. She followed without argument, which told him more than any words would have. The staff corridor ran behind the lounge's east wall, a narrow passage of white-painted cinderblock and overhead fluorescence that hummed at a frequency just low enough to never quite leave your awareness. There were no windows. There were no chairs. There was a wall-mounted monitor for gate status updates, a fire extinguisher in a red bracket, and a secondary utility door at the far end that led to the baggage handling access stairs. Gerald had walked this corridor hundreds of times. Today it felt different. The fluorescent light didn't flicker. It never flickered. It just sat there, even and unsparing, illuminating everything. He turned to face her and opened his tablet without preamble. "I need you to watch something," he said. The video was 47 seconds long. He had already watched it 4 times before entering the airport. Harriet Stowe watched it with the tablet held in her own hands. Gerald watched her face instead of the screen. He had seen people watch footage of themselves before. It was never comfortable, never clean, never what they expected. There was always a moment of displacement, a half second where the brain tried to reconcile the interior narrative with the exterior image. He watched that moment move through Harriet Stowe's expression and come out the other side as something that was not quite recognition and not quite denial, and lived in the narrow, uncomfortable space between them. She handed the tablet back. "The man had no identification presented," she said. Her voice was steady. She had clearly already begun constructing this before he arrived. "He had no membership card, no boarding document indicating platinum tier access, and he matched nothing in my morning brief on expected VIP guests. The lounge protocol for unverified entry is clear. I followed it." Gerald set the tablet down on the narrow ledge below the gate monitor. "Roland Mercer's office sent a formal complaint to airport HR 40 minutes ago," he said. A pause. Small. She absorbed it. "I was not informed that Mr. Mercer was expecting a personal guest," she said. "That information was not communicated to my desk. If the airline's executive team intends to receive private guests outside standard membership verification, the appropriate procedure is advance notification through the lounge coordinator's channel. I did not receive that notification." "Councilman Hugh Delaney called the airport authority director," Gerald said. "He was in the terminal when it happened. He watched the video spread on his phone in real time." Another pause. Less small. "I can't be accountable for who was in the terminal," she said. "The video has been picked up by 3 national news feeds as of 11 minutes ago," Gerald said. He was not raising his voice. He had made a decision before entering this corridor that he would not raise his voice, that he would not perform outrage, that he would simply move through the facts in order and let the weight of them do what weight does. The National Aviation Leadership Summit organization has issued a written statement. It went out on their official feed 20 minutes ago. It identifies the incident by location, time, and the airline involved. Harriet Stowe's hands had come off the tablet ledge. They were now at her sides. Her posture was still technically correct, but something in it had shifted below the surface. A recalibration of effort, the kind the body makes when it's working harder to look effortless. "I followed protocol," she said again. The word protocol was doing significant labor in her sentences, and they both knew it. The HR representative arrived 17 minutes later. Her name was Constance Frey, and she had driven from the airport administration building on the terminal's east concourse, and she walked into the staff corridor, carrying a printed folder and a company-issued laptop, and the specific expression of a person who had been pulled out of 2 other meetings to handle this one. She introduced herself, confirmed Harriet Stowe's employee ID number from memory, and opened the folder on the same ledge where Gerald had set his tablet. What followed was not a confrontation, it was documentation. Constance Frey walked through the incident timeline. She had it in 15-minute segments, sourced from the lounge's internal entry log, the corridor security camera footage timestamps, and the uploaded video's own metadata. She asked Harriet Stowe to confirm or correct each segment. Harriet Stowe confirmed most of them. She corrected none of them. When the timeline reached the moment of physical removal, Constance Frey turned the folder to show Harriet Stowe a printed still from the security camera, a wide angle, overhead, in full afternoon fluorescent clarity, showing Terence Bullock's right hand with 2 fingers hooked into the sleeve of a man's faded olive Henley. "I directed security to assist in the removal," Harriet Stowe said. "That is within my authority as lounge manager during an access dispute." Terence Bullock was interviewed at 2:14 p.m., Constance Frey said. She didn't look up from the folder. "He confirmed that he was following your direct verbal instruction. He also confirmed that you described the individual to him as a, quote, terminal vagrant who wandered up from the gate level. The fluorescent light did not flicker. It just sat there." "I don't believe I used those words," Harriet Stowe said. Isaiah Navarro was interviewed at 2:22 p.m., Constance Frey said. He stated that he raised a verbal concern about the removal to you before it was carried out. He stated that you told him, and I'm reading directly, "I didn't ask for your opinion. I asked you to do your job." Isaiah Navarro is a junior security contractor, Harriet Stowe said. He was performing his first solo shift on this concourse. His read of the situation was, "His read," Gerald said quietly, "was that something was wrong." Harriet Stowe stopped. She looked at him. He met her eyes without expression and did not look away. "I want to be clear about something," she said, and her voice had shifted register, lower now, more deliberate, carrying the weight of a person who has decided that the best remaining defense is to assert the reasonableness of their intentions. "I had no way of knowing who that man was. He was wearing worn civilian clothing. He had no visible credentials. He was not on any guest list that had been communicated to my station. There was nothing in his presentation that indicated anything other than what I assessed. I made a judgment call under the conditions I was given, and I acted within." Constance Frey turned the folder to a new page and set it flat on the ledge. Vivienne Caldwell issued Pinnacle Airways' formal public statement. At 2:47 p.m., she said, "I have a copy here. It names the incident, describes the employee role involved, and states directly that the airline has initiated an internal review with full cooperation from airport HR, and that the relevant personnel decisions will be completed by end of business today." Harriet Stowe read the statement. She read it twice. The argument she had been building, the careful procedural architecture of protocol and notification gaps, and reasonable judgment under incomplete information, had been standing on the assumption that the weight of the response would be proportional to the weight of a misidentified lounge guest. A complaint, a reprimand, a formal note in her file, something manageable and survivable and containable within the machinery of institutional process. What she was reading was not that. What she was reading was a company publicly positioning itself on the other side of a line that she was standing on alone. "The Summit Organization's statement," she said. Her voice was even. She was working to keep it even. "How specific is it? It identifies the incident and thanks the airline for its response," Constance Frey said. "It does not name you. The Pinnacle statement also does not name you. The video, which has now been viewed," she checked her laptop screen, 240,000 times in the last 3 hours, "does not require either statement to name you. You are identifiable on screen. Your badge is visible in the still frames." Harriet Stowe said nothing. Councilman Delaney's office has formally requested that the airport authority review its third-party lounge management contracts, Gerald said. That request went to the director's desk at 1:55 p.m. I was copied on the notification because I'm the shift supervisor of record. Harriet Stowe turned to look at him. Something had gone out of her face in the last several minutes. Not the composure which she was maintaining with what was clearly an enormous act of professional will, but whatever had been underneath the composure, the certainty that had been the engine of all of it. The absolute and unexamined confidence that she had read the room correctly, assigned the correct category to the correct person, and acted with the authority to which she was fully entitled. That was gone. In its place was something that Gerald recognized and did not feel satisfaction at recognizing, because satisfaction would have been the wrong response to watching someone discover the exact dimensions of what they had done. Constance Frey closed the folder. "We're going to need you to come with me to the administration office," she said. "There are additional interviews that need to be completed and documentation that requires your signature before we can conclude the review." "I'd like to call my union representative," Harriet Stowe said. "That is your right," Constance Frey said. "You're welcome to make that call on the way." The HR office was on the airport's administrative level, 2 floors above the main terminal. It had no windows. The walls were painted the particular shade of off-white that administrative spaces everywhere default to, as if the bureaucratic act of being institutional requires its own specific color. The fluorescent lighting overhead was the same overhead fluorescent lighting that ran through every corridor of Hargrove International. The same light that had flooded Gate D7 when Harriet Stowe had leaned into Jasper Flynn's personal space that morning. The same light that had illuminated the crowd that laughed. Same light. The room was smaller. The power inside it had redistributed entirely. The formal notice was a single page. It sat on the table in front of the empty chair. Constance Frey had explained that Harriet Stowe would be given time to review it before signing, that her union representative was en route and would arrive within 40 minutes, and that the room was available to her in the meantime. She had said this with the practiced neutrality of someone who delivers difficult processes and understands that neutrality is its own form of respect, that it does not minimize, and it does not perform. Then she had closed the door. Harriet Stowe sat down. The formal notice was a single page. She did not pick it up. She could read the first 3 lines from where she sat, and she knew what the rest of them said without reading them. The way you sometimes know the end of something before it arrives, because the logic of events, once it has reached sufficient momentum, does not require you to be told what it has already decided. The fluorescent light held everything steady and even and entirely without shadow. The room did not offer her anything. The silence did not end. The Hargrove Grand Ballroom sat inside afternoon sunlight, the way a cathedral sits inside its own quiet, deliberately, completely, as if the light had always belonged there. Floor-to-ceiling windows along the western wall pulled in 4 o'clock sun without apology, flooding the space in warm, unfiltered gold. 500 chairs filled the floor in neat rows, and every single one of them was occupied. The ballroom chandeliers burned overhead in full, bright arrays, not for ambiance but for clarity, the kind of light that leaves nothing soft, nothing hidden, nothing that can be mistaken. Lorraine Baptiste stood at the service entrance to the left of the stage, a pressed garment bag over one arm and her phone in the other hand. The live stream counter read 11,000 viewers and was climbing every 30 seconds. She had stopped refreshing it because watching the numbers move had started to feel like watching someone breathe. Relentless, alive, and slightly overwhelming. A local base liaison had come through within 2 hours of her first call, pulling a dress uniform from a ceremonial storage unit 40 minutes from the venue. The silver star sat centered on the breast pocket. The distinguished flying cross flanked it. The wings sat above everything, as they always had. The highest point, the first thing the eye found. The olive Henley and the frayed cargo pants were folded neatly inside a canvas bag beside the podium. Jasper Flynn had asked for that specifically. He had looked at Lorraine when he said it, calm and direct, the way he looked at everything. He said, "I want them there." She hadn't asked why. She already knew. The room rose before he reached the microphone. 500 people, some at lanyards and pressed blazers and name badges, on their feet the moment Colonel Jasper Flynn walked out from the stage wing. The applause was not polite applause, not the measured conference-appropriate clap that fills rooms out of obligation. This was the sound of people who had watched a 47-second video and needed somewhere to put what it made them feel. They put it here. They put it into 60 seconds of sustained standing noise that bounced off the high windows and filled every corner of the room. Jasper Flynn walked to the microphone. He stood straight, hands loose at his sides, and waited. After 60 seconds, he raised one hand, a single unhurried gesture, and the room came down. He looked out at them for a moment before he spoke. In the front row, Roland Mercer sat with his jacket buttoned and his hands folded, watching with the same expression he had worn at the lounge glass earlier that day. Not surprise, not performance, but something quieter than both. In the back row, Captain Delia Okafor stood against the wall with her arms crossed and her eyes fixed on the podium. She had driven directly from the airport. She was still in her flight uniform. Dark navy jacket, captain's bars on the shoulders, black slacks. She had not been invited to the summit. She had come anyway. In the media section, Fatima Osei held her phone steady, filming. The caption on her original post had been updated 4 hours ago. It read simply, "They found him." Jasper Flynn said, "I want to talk to you about turbulence." The room settled into a complete, held silence. "Not the kind that shows up on a weather report," he said. "The kind that shows up without warning, without cause, in the middle of a heading you already set. The kind that has nothing to do with where you're going, only with what you have to pass through to get there. Every pilot in this room knows what I mean. You know that the instrument doesn't lie. You know that if you've set the right heading, the turbulence is not a redirection. It's just air." He paused. "I learned early in my career, 22 years ago, in a cockpit over airspace that doesn't appear on civilian maps, that the most dangerous thing you can do in turbulence is overcorrect. You pull the yoke too hard, you fight the resistance instead of trusting your instruments, and you become the problem. The turbulence was never going to take you down. You were." He let that land. The discipline isn't in the response. The discipline is in the stillness, in knowing that the heading you set was true, and that the truth will do the work if you give it enough room. Several people in the room exchanged glances. A woman in the third row pressed 2 fingers to her mouth. Roland Mercer looked at the floor for exactly 2 seconds, then looked back up. Jasper Flynn continued, "Aviation is the only field I know where we measure courage not in motion, but in the willingness to hold course. We don't award medals for noise. We don't give wings to the pilot who panicked well. We give them to the one who held the line when everything in his body said otherwise." He paused again. "This morning I had occasion to remember that." He did not say Harriet Stowe's name. He did not say the lounge. He did not say the corridor, or the bench, or the 2 fingers in his sleeve. He did not say any of it. He didn't have to. Every person in that room had watched 47 seconds of video, and every person in that room understood exactly what altitude sounded like when a man had come back from it. The applause at the end lasted longer than the one at the beginning. Lorraine Baptiste, watching the live stream countertip past 47,000, stopped trying to count anything at all. Jasper Flynn stepped down from the podium and shook Roland Mercer's hand. Roland Mercer held it with both of his and said nothing, because nothing was the right answer. Then Jasper Flynn walked the length of the room, past every row, past every lanyard and blazer and face, to the back wall where Captain Delia Okafor was standing. She didn't move as he approached. He stopped in front of her. He didn't say thank you. He said, "How many hours do you have?" She said, 8,412. He said, "Then you know exactly what that felt like up there." She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she nodded once, the nod of someone who has spent a career being precise about what counts. Outside the summit venue windows, the afternoon sky was wide, unobstructed, and the exact shade of blue that looks different from 30,000 feet, cleaner, quieter, and entirely without ceiling. You just heard a story that history tried to overlook. If it stayed with you, take a second to stand with it. Subscribe, share, and help us keep telling the stories that deserve light, not silence.